guest speaker this evening is Ittai Frank, an architect who will speak all about the Jewish architects who made Britain their home after fleeing persecution in 1930s Europe. And as they made Britain their home, they also came here with, with an influence of early Zionist ideology and a modernist expression in their work for these architects. And now, today, many of those who came are recognised today for their major contributions to some of Britain's most important modernist buildings. Our guest speaker himself, Ittai, welcome Ittai. He specialises in analysis techniques and in methods of developing low energy design solutions. So all very, very current and environmentally aware issues. His credentials are fantastic. He's taught at university level design courses, and he served as guest juror at various universities in London. He's head of Modern Methods of Construction, MMC, at a Studio Architects based in London. And that's where he makes use of advanced digital modeling and innovative design processes in the delivery of modular design schemes. I was just explaining to Ittai before all of you were admitted that I actually come from an architectural background too. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Ittai. And so, without further ado, I would just ask again, if all of you who have your video on, could you please turn off your video and could you please mute your audio? And so, without further ado, Ittai, the floor or the screen is yours. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. That's great. Hello, everyone. Yes, I think Stephen gave quite a nice introduction, but I'll just say, I mean, my background, my personal background is I'm half British, half Israeli. My father is from Hampstead. In a way, the story that I'm going to tell has a kind of personal side as well. And so it's a project, a side project that I've just been interested in the past few years, that evolved from a walk that I've done with JW3 in Hampstead, and basically trying to tell this narrative of all these lovely designs that have been during the 30s, a very specific time, by these group of Jewish immigrants. I'll talk a few today, probably the most prominent ones. But there are many, and I think in a way it's very interesting to try to link all their beliefs and ideology into kind of one story, and that's what I'm going to try to do today. So I will share my screen. Yeah, hold on. Okay, Stephen, can you see the screen?
Ooh.
Hold on a second.
Yes, we see the screen, Ittai. We see, yes.
Okay, so I guess the first question is, I mean, architecture can be seen as an expression of values, and if we're talking about this period of huge innovation between the two world wars, that in a way great ideas, radical ideas were developed, many were realized. And a lot of these ideas found ground in Jewish intellectuals, a lot of them socialists. And I guess the question was that I'm afraid to ask, but I think is interesting to ask, I mean, is there a Jewish architecture? Is there something that we can define as a Jewish architecture? And I think in a way, there's always been elements of Jewish architecture, but in this specific context, there was a kind of Jewish ideology at the time that resonated very much with a lot of other ideologies, i.e. modernism, which I will discuss in a second. And these had a lot of common ground to them. In a way, this is a time where obviously nationalism was growing, and Jewish identity was at a bit of an identity crisis, because a lot of the Jewish intellectuals at the time didn't see themselves as nationalists. They saw themselves as European first, and then if it was German or French, and they tried to find a new identity, would be global. And in a way, this is one of the primal drivers of Zionism, in a way to try to find a kind of nationalist identity that led to the emergence of Israel. Now, I'm gonna analyze a lot of the buildings with two basic parameters, one being material and one being spatial. So the language, in a way of modernism, is glass, which is a very democratic, transparent material, uses transparency. That was a common thread in a lot of modernist buildings. Concrete, obviously, can be built anywhere. It's very low cost. And gives it a very democratic, low level, accessible to all appeal. And metal is a material that binds everything together. It can be joined, it can be modular, it can be created very quickly in industrial means. So those were all materials that were favored by the modernists, not for the aesthetic value only, but also for their ethical value as well. The other element that I'll look at buildings is spatial. And that is how people interact, what happens in the spaces between buildings, what happens in the spaces inside the buildings. And those are two elements that are very crucial to understanding how the language of architecture and how it relates to their expression of values, as I've explained. Okay, so first of all, this is almost, how do we link all these different ideas that were forming in this time? So the first two ideas that I want to talk about are ideas that developed in the 19th century. One is a kind of socialist idealism that was developing in throughout Europe and in England as well. And the second is the arts and crafts movement. Now, both of these were, in the sense, a reaction to industrialization. There were many industrial segregation of the rich and the poor, which led to a lot of socialist ideas, such as Marxism, and that story is well known. The arts and crafts movements, for those who don't know, was a movement in the UK that was a reaction to industrialization and called for a return to nature and natural forms, and tried to find a new aesthetic that went back to the crafts, the guilds, and tried to find a reconnection with nature in a very profound way. Now, these two ideas fed into three major streams in late 19th century and early 20th century. The first being the Garden City movement, which I'll talk about in a second. The second being Zionism, and the third being early modernism. Now, what I'll focus in this lecture is how these three ideologies actually had a common ground that fed into what was built in the interwar years in Britain, and the British Mandate of Palestine, and immigrants that came to both of these. So in a way, many Zionists came to Israel, or at the time it was the British Mandate of Palestine, and many came to Britain. And what I'm trying to, in this lecture, to illustrate is the common ground that they had and the ideas that they brought into this world. So, and then, as far as the legacy that they gave, the welfare state in the early years post-war, welfare state in the UK, and the early Israel under Labour post-48, both had a lot of common ideas that I'll try to link as well in the course of this lecture. So first of all, I just want to kind of browse through the basic ideas that went through. So the first, the Garden City movement, which is, as I said, a reaction to industrialization. The main figure in this movement was Sir Ebenezer Howard, who wrote a very influential book, The Garden Cities of Tomorrow. And he looked at a way of reconnecting with antiquity, with nature, how once people were living, and how you can reconnect to that idea of living within nature and having that balance with the city as well. And he created quite an interesting approach in a way, the precursor to the modern suburb, that these satellite cities around with green belts around them that connected to a main hub of the central city in the middle. Now, these cities developed in this time, and this is quite a nice quote of his: the pathway to experiment worth achieving is strewn with failures. Success is for the most part built on failure. So he had tried to push this idea in the beginning, not successfully, but in the end had a profound effect on how design of cities were evolved. And he tried to find that right balance between city and nature. And there's a very socialist approach to the way he looked at it. I mean, he saw the individuals of a city being part of a group of trustees and participating in the decision-making process. Two substantial cities that were designed in this time is Letchworth Garden City and Welwyn Garden City. You could see a lot of common characteristics between the two. If it's the green belt around them, the non-grid alignment, something that's very sensitive to the local environment, the context. It was very important for him to relate to a contextual, an identity of a city. And these two cities had a huge impact on other garden cities that came afterwards. Another interesting figure in the Garden City movement that I will mention later is Sir Patrick Gatiss. And he was an interesting person in the sense that he was both a biologist, a researcher, an urban planner, and all of these ideas came together in one idea of biological evolution. And he saw society almost as an organism that evolved through biological change. And he saw this as a key to creating a healthy environment for people to live in. And he saw, in a way, the family is the key biological unit. And in a way, everything evolves from that. Interestingly, he also used sociology. He used a lot of surveys. He tried to understand what people need. And the interesting part of his approach, that cities actually evolved. He asked people what they like, what they don't like, and every part of the city that grew was actually informed by ideas that he had, or information that he gathered from live surveys from the people living in that city. Next is labor Zionism, which I won't go into that too much, obviously, because I'm sure most of you know what it is. But I think the interesting aspect of labor Zionism is this figure, A.D. Gordon, which was, in a sense, a spiritual force behind labor Zionism or practical Zionism, which formed the backbone of all the institutions of early Israel, and had a huge influence on the way Israel was developed, and as far as the ideas that built Israel, early Israel. And his approach was very similar. He looked at nature as something that was lost, a kind of link that was lost with nature, and he wanted to reconnect to that link. And through physical labor and agriculture, one can reconnect to that world. And again, he looked at organic bonds like family, community, and nation over the mechanical bonds like state and party and class, which he saw as something that was not organically linked to the way people interact with each other. And in a way, that's how he saw Israel or Zionism. He wanted people to have a strong link to the earth, a strong link to how they interact with each other. And that image of the halutz, which pretty much created the backbone of how the image of the early Israeli, as it were, the intellectual that works in the field, that writes poetry, and all these ideas of this bourgeoisie people that came to Israel and went back to, left their intellectual background and went to work the earth, was very much influenced by his approach and his vision of how this would how a correct way of living and interacting with each other. Okay, and this leads us to early modernism and how that links to all this. So early modernism, perhaps is, you know, modernism is perceived as something maybe quite static and maybe not, you don't think of organic approach when you first think about modernism, but in fact, early modernism were very much influenced by nature and how you connect with nature. A lot of Japanese architecture influenced early modernist designs. This is, of course, Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House, and that link with nature, that breaking of inside and outside, was key to what early modernism preached. An interesting illustration of this, maybe, which was done by Pierre Mondrian, which had a huge effect on modernism and its aesthetic, is his kind of transition between, in his painting, between essentially painting a tree and that gradually abstracting into a pure, almost not how the tree looks like, but what the tree is in an abstract way. And he developed this aesthetic that was pure abstraction, but as you can see in the way his the gene that developed this abstraction was looking at nature and trying to understand this view of how we perceive nature and how you can create an aesthetic out of it. And finally, of course, Le Corbusier, who had a huge impact on modernism. And he, I mean, in a way, it's difficult to, he developed the idea of a architecture as a machine, or living as a machine for living. But his approach of building high was, in a way, the impetus for this was creating green spaces between, and probably his most iconic building, the Villa Savoie, had a strong relationship between inside and outside courtyards, which had a huge influence on a lot of the immigrant architects that I'll discuss later. Which brings us to the Bauhaus, which probably had the biggest influence of all on what modernist ideology is about. It's probably definitely the most influential school in the 20th century, perhaps even ever. And just for those of you who don't know the history of it, it was founded in 1919, and it tried to create an ambitious, brought all the idea of the craftsman, similar to the arts and crafts movement, but just basically tried to translate the idea of the craftsman to the modern age, to the industrial age. And they wanted to create a total art for a new era. They moved at some point to, in 1925, to a building in Dessau. And the interesting thing about this building is that it pretty much brought together all the ideas that, that modernism is. The use of materials, concrete, glass, metal, pristine shapes, geometric shapes, a strong community, a lot of spatial interactions where communal activity can take place. And in a way, he saw it as a band of fellow workers inspired by the common will. And the background of it is very socialist, very idealistic. And in a way, this was seen as a mini utopia of how a modern society can live. At the time, the top minds were working at the Bauhaus. I mean, it was a hugely creative a laboratory of ideas. And just a few of the people that worked here was Paul Klee, Kandinsky, Schemmer, Maholy-Nagy, Albers, Marcel Breuer, many of which were Jewish, and every person brought something that was radical and different to this hotbed of ideas and creativity that they together tried to find a new language for, as they saw, a new era. Now, the interesting part of the Bauhaus was its pedagogical approach to how one would see nature. In a way, they saw the way you teach and the way you design as something that is intrinsic to a natural process. And they saw an equilibrium with the natural world is almost a metaphor to the utopian society that they tried to create. So again, they tried to create a very organic society that is linked to organic bonds. They even at some point farmed peas, potatoes, lentils, in a way to try to reconnect to the earth, in a way very similar to what A.D. Gordon was writing about in his books. In a way, the two most prominent on a pedagogical level was Paul Klee and Maholy-Nagy. Both of them wrote extensively about the relationship with nature, how one can try to understand growth, and Maholy-Nagy talked a lot about the aura of nature that is expressed, and all of these were funneled into the preliminary design course in the Bauhaus, which is probably the most important course that defines the ideas that would come later on. Unfortunately, with the rise of Nazi Germany in 1930s, the Bauhaus was closed down. The ideas of the Bauhaus were very much was polar opposite to what Nazis believed in, and in fact, many of the staff and the students were Jewish, and the Bauhaus building was sacked, and Nazis just came in and they razed the whole building, and only through international intervention they didn't actually tear it down, luckily, and it's still standing today. But it was a very abrupt stop to a very short period of time of very creative and innovative ideas. So many of these immigrants that studied in the Bauhaus and all over Europe came to Britain. And these are the 7 that I will talk about in this lecture. As I said, there are many more, but I think these are probably the ones that had the most contribution to English, British modernism and world modernism for that matter. So the first is Maholy-Nagy, as I've kind of mentioned before. He was hugely instrumental in the Bauhaus, one of the primal forces of the staff. And in a way, this is a nice quote of his: "A new architecture on its highest plane will be called upon to remove the old conflict between organic and artificial, between open and closed, between country and city." And you could already see, if he had this echoes a lot of the arts and crafts movement, the Garden City movement, and Zionism, for that matter, in what he preached. Similar to Mondrian, he had a series of paintings, abstract paintings, in which he tried to take natural processes and try to abstract them into an aesthetic language. He had 2 hats in a way in the Bauhaus. One was his work. He did a lot of photography, film experimentation, and he was head of the preliminary design course, as I said. So in a way, he had a huge influence on the ideas that would be developed later on, and by these students that would spread the globe afterwards. Another influence that he had was a book that he wrote about von Material zu Architecture, which in a way, when translated, was one of the first English translated books of Bauhaus ideas. So essentially it was one of the first translation of Bauhaus to any English-speaking person, and especially in England. When he came to London, he basically had was part of a very close-knit circle of intellectuals and artists that based themselves mainly in Hampstead. And while he was there, he tried to find, his research tried to find biological basis of space experiences, which basically means he tried to find a biological links between elements, as you can see here, and how that can be translated into space. So none of these ideas were actually realized in London, but he was then offered quite a prestigious job in Chicago to found the new Bauhaus School of Design, a hugely influential school that had a massive effect on the city of Chicago and modernism as a whole. And unfortunately, he didn't stay long in London, but while he was there, he had a huge influence on other architects, designers living in London at the time. Second is Marcel Breuer, another Bauhaus tutor that came to London. He was Hungarian originally, and he was the youngest student in the Bauhaus, and quite quickly Gropius saw that Gropius, who was head of the Bauhaus, saw the talent that he had, and he appointed him as the head of the carpentry shop. And they held a close relationship throughout his life. Now, a lot of his designs at the time were hugely iconic, and they still have a lasting effect today. I mean, just the idea of using tubular steel furniture, I mean, we almost take it for granted today, but he experimented with that, and in a way, he innovated with that use to something that's completely common furniture today. Another design that he did was the lobby of the Isokon building. Now, the Isokon building was an interesting place that was in a way, essentially was the first modernist building in London. It was in Hampstead, and it was almost a magnet for modernist designers and intellectuals that gravitated to it and lived there in a very communal environment. They had a communal bar at the bottom and on the roof. And many ex-Bauhaus tutors lived here, many of which are Jewish. Laszlo Molinaggi lived there, Breuer, Naum Slutsky, and they all created this hub of activity in this bar that Breuer designed, which was, if Hampstead was the hub of this intellectual activity, so this bar was the hub of that hub, and anybody that had an influence in this circle sat there and discussed new ideas, and it was very much a focal point for all these ideas to take place. While he was there as well, he worked for the Isokon furniture company, which owned the building as well, and he designed, I mean, all these iconic furniture pieces that he experimented a lot with timber and laminated timber. Again, you could see the influence on anything from IKEA today to, I mean, at the time, this was quite innovative approach to design, but that influenced him, and you could see it today. And these are all designs that he developed while he was staying in the UK. The next architect is Lubetkin, who, in a way, different from Marcel Breuer and Molinaggi, his background was different. He came from Russia. And so he wasn't Bauhaus, but he was influenced. And interesting to see that actually he had a lot of common ideas with them, just to see how these ideas actually cross-fertilized each other. And so he lived in Paris for a time, and he was influenced very much by Le Corbusier and the constructivism. And he came to London in 1931, where he founded the architectural practice Tecton. One of his first commissions was probably a project that some of you know, is the penguin, the London Zoo penguin Penguin House and the Gorilla House. He, from quite early on, he was a huge innovator in anything to do with concrete. And even today, the pure ambition of what he did here is immense. He saw it as almost like a utopist environment for penguins where everyone is equal. Unfortunately, at some point, the penguins were moved due to certain people were objecting to the way to the way penguins are seen. But I think as far as the structure itself, just the thickness, I mean, this was hugely innovative at the time and caused a lot of waves throughout the world just by the use of concrete and what it can do. His first house was also interesting in the UK because in a way he tried to take the standard English terrace house and translate it through concrete to a modern aesthetic. And in a way, the approach here was the challenge was that this was quite a steep site. So many of the previous, the surrounding houses basically had a garage at the bottom and then the house started at the top. And what he did is he combined the top and bottom and the spiral staircase goes up so that the living room is at the first floor and then you just enter up through the spiral staircase. And that was quite a different way of perceiving how people live that would basically characterize a lot of his designs afterwards to try to redefine how people live. And a lot of his houses that actually I won't talk about today were social housing. And he was incredibly influential in how people interact within a social environment. This is the inside. You can see his influence by Le Corbusier. Very clean lines, horizontal windows, a lot of natural light, very clean and environment. In the relationship to the outside space is very immediate, similar to a lot of other modernist houses. Which leads us also to probably his most prominent residential project in High Point 1, which I'm sure a lot of you know. And this was hugely innovative for its time, mainly because of its construction techniques, which used modular construction in a way that wasn't used before. The use of concrete, you could see in its very lovely detailed balconies. And it was to this day, I mean, Le Corbusier himself saw this and he said, this is a model of how middle-class living should be. And even some cited it as one of the finest middle-class housing projects in the world. And the big achievement of this project is, in a way, the communal and the private and the link between the two. And something that wasn't taken for granted at the time, that you either had blocks or you had a private housing. And in a way, this tried to combine the amenities of communal living in a block that is actually high rise, something that's actually coming back today. You can see, I mean, just this is some of the communal areas, some of the lovely detailing of the balconies. This is straight influenced by Le Corbusier himself. You can see that the influence from his Villa Savoie. And yeah, I mean, in a way, it's just a very clean, in a way, a lot of unassuming maybe, but at its time was hugely innovative. And maybe today we look at it as almost something that isn't so special, but that's just because its huge influence at the time affected a lot of designs that came afterwards. This building had, it's probably his most political building, and his socialist roots come into play very much in this building, which is the Finsbury Health Centre, which is built by Finsbury in Finsbury in London. And in a way, this combined three elements, the social, the political, and the aesthetic. And in the social, in a way that this was health to all. And this was 10 years before the NHS was founded. This essentially created a building that provides healthcare for everyone and anyone that can that comes in. It was Finsbury actually funded this, so politically this was funded by the government, which was at the time an innovative idea. And the aesthetic was trying to create a new aesthetic for this socialist beacon. I mean, you could see the materials that were used again were glass, concrete, and very much in tune with what he saw as this new language of this socialist-inspired design. So, ironically, during the war, before the war, he was very much a fringe figure. But during the war, his ideas of creating a fair society for everyone resonated quite well with the image that they wanted to project for the New Britain. And this project specifically was used for a poster during the war that was basically saying, this is what we're doing for your country, and trying to galvanize the country around these new developments that are happening. So it was almost like an iconic building for that ideology. Okay, so this leads us to Goldfinger. And Goldfinger is probably the most controversial of, of the figures that I'm going to talk about today. I mean, his designs are quite polarizing, but very influential nonetheless. He was, again, influenced by concrete. He was Hungarian as well. And like Lubetkin, he spent time in Paris, where he was in contact with Le Corbusier, and a lot of those ideas seeped into his own design. He married quite a rich Ursula Blackwell, which was she was heiress to the Cross and Blackwell fortune, so that gave him quite a good economic backing. And in 1934, he moved to High Point, and in a way, he was quite influenced by a lot of Lubetkin's work. And one of the biggest influences was Willow Road, which is now today you could still go there. It's owned by the National Trust. And he moved there and designed it as his own home. Now, again, this was similar to Lubetkin's design. This was trying to take a take on the classic British terrace house and try to redefine it as a modernist concrete block. Now, he did have some problems with planning, and he did clad it in brick, but the actual core of the building was very much concrete. And the advantage of using concrete was essentially he had a central core, which was used as a staircase, which held the whole building together, so that basically only on the outside, on this core, that's where the structure held all the floors together. So what this gave is essentially a completely open plan that can provide a lot of flexibility and a lot of freedom to interior design, and bring in a lot of light into the design itself. Now, the core itself was interestingly designed with over arrow. So for those of you who know that he's probably the most well-known engineer ever, probably in the 20th century for sure, that today that his company or his namesake company employs thousands of people. But this was very much one of the projects that made him famous, that one of his first commissions. And he worked closely with Lubetkin on many commissions, as they both shared this common passion for pushing what concrete can do and making the most of its properties. Just a little anecdote is that Ian Fleming was the neighbor of Goldfinger, and they had a very an interesting relationship. Ian Fleming was very much opposed to this building, and apparently because of this relationship, he named his villain in Goldfinger after Goldfinger in his movie. So this is just highlighting the drum itself. You can see how prominent it is in the design. I mean, just a lovely detailing of the spiral staircase going up, the light coming through, basically using concrete to to its most sculptural abilities, but both structural and sculptural, and spanning across, so that there's only what you need to create this pure function of a staircase. Interestingly, also the facade, I mean, coming back to what I discussed before, the relationship with natural forms and natural proportions, the elevation itself was based on the golden ratio, which is something that's occurred in nature, in spirals, and in a lot of mathematical relationships in the natural world. And that relationship was taken, you can see here, to the windows, as he saw it, to create an aesthetic quality to this facade on the outside. This is the inside. As I said before, the inside was very open. A lot of natural light can come in, and a lot of flexibility to design walls that are temporary as well. And he designed all the furniture. Everything was a kind of total design, as it were. And he tried to create a kind of a clear path from both sides to provide natural ventilation and light. And this was all thanks to the innovative structure that he developed. So next is Ernest Freud, which he's the son of Sigmund Freud. And a lot, I mean, this family is quite well known. And the interesting thing about Ernst Freud was that he's probably the least he was probably not as idealistic as the others. He was very much a bourgeoisie architect. Many of his clients were his dad's patients. But an interesting project that he did do in Hampstead is Frognall Close, which you can see. It's which is based around, it's almost built around the workers' housing. It has a kind of socialist background. It's a common courtyard, a communal area, and it has all these ideas that were common to other architects, but this was designed for primarily middle class bourgeoisie residents of Hampstead. Another building that he did is in East Finchley that originally was quite controversial because it was built for only Jewish families, but they were, in a way, it was seen as the height of luxury for those families, and it created a precedent for how these blocks can be built. You could see that in a way, most of his designs don't expose the concrete. They're much more polite than the other ones, which kind of highlights he was more on the practical side and less on the innovative side. We're speaking of innovation. Arthur Korn, who was German, he essentially wrote, his big contribution was is a lot of the writing that he did and the teaching that he did in London. He wrote a very influential book about glass, and when he came to London, he taught at the AA in London, and he was part of a group that tried to re-envision what London would look like and try to redesign a master plan for London. Now, the interesting thing about the group that was formed, called the Modern Architectural Research Group, or MARS Group, that he was the chair of, was their kind of approach, radical approach to redefining how people see the city. Their design for London was influenced a lot by the Garden City movement, and you could see these green strips that come in, very, in a way, radical and almost completely applicable, because it was so different from, and so what's the word, unworkable in a way, but it had a huge effect on the way people saw London and the green strips or the green spaces that would inform later master plans as well. So finally, this is the final, how are we doing for time? Good, okay, sorry. is Eric Mendelsohn, was probably the most, as far as architectural expression is concerned, the design, he's probably the most well-known. And he pretty much epitomized the whole idea of a traveling Jew. He traveled from place to place, and he left his mark in every place that he went. He was different from the others, and he was a very prominent architect in Germany before he had to flee. He had a very successful practice, very famous practice. I mean, in a way, he was the first kind of starchitect, as it were. One of his first designs was the Einstein Tower in Potsdam. And I mean, just the pure, how different and how innovative and forward thinking this building is. I mean, it was just using concrete to its uttermost limits. So there's no straight line in this building. Everything was cast in place. And this building created a lot of waves throughout the world, and definitely put him on the map. So unfortunately, he had to leave with the rise of Nazism. He had to leave Germany, but he came to England and he left his mark here as well. Probably the most famous of his buildings in the UK was the Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill. And again, his use of flowing forms, something that it characterizes a lot of architecture today. But he essentially, he was a precursor to that 100 years before. And quite just elegant design, and the use of movement in his design was very much a part of how people move, how people interact. This was a staircase. This is the outside. It was very popular, and when it was built, it was almost an iconic building. And its use of concrete was, again, hugely innovative, and just pushing the limits of what concrete can do. And glass and metal as well, for that matter. He built in Israel extensively as well. This was while he was in London. Chaim Weizmann contacted him. He knew about his designs, and he wanted him to design a house for him, which became the Weizmann house. The interesting approach he had here is, again, his sensitivity to vernacular architecture. So he didn't try. He didn't try to force his language. He tried to understand the local language, and he used a courtyard and a lot of local elements for thick walls, smaller windows, less glass, to adapt to the local climate in a way that was very successful. And this house is still seen today as something quite an achievement. Again, the spiral staircases, less use of concrete. This was a president's home. So, but you can see his signature moves are still there very much. Okay, so I just want to speak, I mean, the story of what how these ideas actually found their expression in Israel at the time, or Palestine at the time, is a lecture in its own right. But I think it's interesting to link it to these ideas, because these ideas were at the same time that this was happening in the UK. These ideas being realized on a massive scale in the emerging, or yet emerging, state of Israel. And so a lot of these ideologies that resonated with Zionism were incorporated. So one of the most prominent one was the Tel Aviv Master Plan. And for that, Sir Patrick Geddes was invited to propose his master plan in the Garden City movement, in the vision of how he saw the Garden City movement. And it still remains one of the few examples of a Garden City that was basically built from scratch by Geddes and realized quite successfully. The interesting, what he obviously the use of gardens, very sensitive to the local climates. The linear orientation is meant to work with the movement of the sun, so that if the strong south facing sunlight basically is maximized, the shadow is maximized. The winds from the sea are used with the major boulevards that bring in natural ventilation from the sea. So a lot of the local conditions were incorporated into this design. His background as a biologist was used also to create almost a typology of a hierarchy between these local gardens that creates a kind of cell, as it were, in the city that make up a larger environment with the larger urban centers such as Dizengoff and Rothschild and all these squares in the center of Tel Aviv. And yeah, and the ideas of the Garden City were very much prominent here, and this resonated very much with Zionists at the time, and they saw this as their connection with the ground. Tel Aviv was seen as a kind of urban but agricultural environment as well, and you could see that here in an early city. And to populate these cities, these blocks, many immigrants came. Probably one of the most prominent architect was Aryeh Sharon, who was a student at the Bauhaus, and on his arrival to Israel or Palestine at the time, had many commissions, and had many public institutions, many cinemas, and had a huge influence on the design of modernist buildings in Israel. One building that I just want to talk about is his cooperative housing in Tel Aviv. And in a way, this was an expression of both the social aspect and also the material aspect of the Bauhaus, and of Zionism in general. And this was a communal courtyard at the time, which was very innovative, because the plots of Tel Aviv at the time were designed as individual plots. And basically what he said is, I'll take those plots and combine them into one and create one communal space for everyone to enjoy. Now, this was a quite radical approach and had to redefine the master plan, but was seen as a blueprint for a lot of further communal housing that would be in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and everywhere in Israel under these kind of Zionist cooperative workers' housing complexes. You can see here the unit itself. A lot of emphasis on how people would interact in these buildings. Which brings us in a way to a full circle, because in a way, Aryeh Sharon was also the designer of the World Zionist Organization building in Tel Aviv, which creates a nice ending to this. And in a way, you can see a lot of the influence, the use of concrete, the use of glass, in that language that he tried to develop. And obviously, the World Zionist Organization had a lot of appreciation for, because they used it for this building. So do we have time? What's 5:02? Okay, so I could run quickly. I thought I'd just kind of show you some of the stuff that I'm working on. It won't take very long, and then we can potentially open this up to some Q&A. So basically, as Stephen has said, I head the MMC department in A Studio, which basically what we do is we try to look at how technology meets nature. That's a kind of driving element of two things that we see today, technology being the defining element of how we communicate and how we build, and nature is something that we should always connect to and always remember. And so MMC, which officially is a Modern Methods of Construction, basically encapsulates everything that is new and modern, and it's mainly used in the context of modular housing and how we can develop new aesthetics for how modular housing can be built. This is a scheme for modular housing for temporary accommodation in Desborough Road in Wickham, And in a way, the population is quite vulnerable. And we thought of how to reconnect a sense of community for these people and have them connect with each other, and have a lot of work was done on the landscape and how we can create quite pleasant communal area for all of them to, at the brief time that they are there, they can interact with each other and perhaps heal. Another project is the Olympic Legacy Project in Eastwick and Sweetwater. Again, big emphasis on public realm and how people interact. This is another modular scheme, and we developed some interesting digital tools to assess solar analysis to have these units as ecologically viable as possible, but also adapt to specific constraints of the London housing plan, and essentially how modular fabrication can be realized. There's another the way we work is we always analyze the solar analysis. This is a project that we used what's called a genetic algorithm to create performance criteria. I always use like a biological process to analyze different options using different parameters that we defined before. If it's views, connectivity with or solar analysis, and try to find solutions that best address all those performance criteria. And in a way that's using the computer to not design for us, but essentially help us understand or make us better designers and make better decisions and find better spaces for these residential environments. So, okay, so if you have any questions, we can.
Okay. Well, Ittai, that was fascinating. For me, you know, with my background in architecture, it was absolutely fascinating, and I hope that everyone who's still with us has found it equally so. We've had a few questions come through on the chat, so I shall start asking them now as I go through them. Just bear with me. So one question from Lucille Cohen: was there ever any overlap between the Art Deco and the Bauhaus influence in Britain from these refugee architects?
Yes, there was. I mean, I think one example is what I gave. Ernst Freud is probably the most obvious overlap. And the way Art Deco was a precursor to modernism in the UK. So before modernism arrived, Art Deco was something that was already there, and a lot of the buildings designs were already there to begin with. Art Deco was less had a less ideological approach. It was more a bourgeoisie kind of design, but a lot of the common languages, if there's use of concrete, the forms, the clean forms, I mean, there's definitely an overlap between the two. But Art Deco came from a different background in a way.
Sure, okay. So a gentleman here by the name of David Grossman has asked you that you've mentioned links with nature in terms of this modernist architecture, this modernist ideology, but you haven't mentioned use of structural timber, for example, structural timber frames, ceiling members. Is there any reason? Has it, to what degree have those materials, been present or part of the modernist ideology?
I think, there was mostly for furniture. Structural timber has come into the discussion quite late. I think someone said that if concrete is the material of the 20th century, structural timber is a material of the 21st century. I think the early modernists, they didn't see that. They mainly focused on concrete, glass, and steel in most of their designs. It was, I think, later, the later waves of modernists used timber much more. If it was Alvar Aalto, obviously, There was, I mean, it's almost like a different stream, but it wasn't the mainstream of modernism.
Right.
But it definitely was there. Yeah, I don't have anything. I think it came into prominence much more. I think more of the Scandinavian designs were using timber much more, but none of those. I don't recall that having a big influence in the immigrants coming to the UK.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Another question from Kay Bagon. Why did the Nazis close down the Bauhaus when Gropius wasn't even Jewish? Is there any reason?
Well, as I say, yeah. So a lot of the ideology of the Bauhaus, the abstract, it was seen as the Nazis call it, degenerate art. They saw it as a kind of socialist, abstract, all the things that Nazis were were very much opposed to. Yeah. So on an ideological level, they saw that as something of a corrupting influence to what they believed in. So they saw that as a big danger to what they saw. And the way that whole intellectual approach of the Bauhaus, I mean, all these things were, yeah, something that didn't fit well with the Nazi Party in general.
Right.
So I think in a way, it's interesting that they did sit well with a lot of Jewish ideas. So in a way, that link is quite interesting to make, but it definitely didn't, yeah, work with what they saw as art. I mean, I think they held a lot of exhibitions, what degenerate art is, and a lot of the Bauhaus artists featured in those exhibitions of what is not allowed to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was definitely a driving element there.
Okay. And we have a very interesting question here from Barbara Christian, saying that she'd be very interested to know if you have come across any female architects contributing to the British modernist architecture and or early Israeli architecture.
Yes, I mean, there is, she designed the interior of the museum, the Israel Museum. Doa Gad is her name.
Right.
And she was very influential in Israel. Mm-hmm. And Gerstein as well. I mean, yeah, there were quite a few in Israel. I think, yeah, it is an interesting question. I think, you know, at the time, obviously, there were many female students at the Bauhaus, and they clearly had a huge effect on architecture in the world. Yeah, that's a good point. I should probably include a few next lecture.
Right. We know, I'm assuming most people in this webinar are very aware that in Tel Aviv, UNESCO have bestowed it a UNESCO status, the White City, recognizing its abundance of Bauhaus architecture. To what degree has England bestowed any sort of specific status on some or any of the buildings that you've mentioned this evening? Or the, you know, other buildings by the architects that you've mentioned this evening. I seem to recall you mentioning one of Goldfinger's buildings that has English heritage or national heritage status.
Yeah, English heritage. Yeah.
Right. Are there any others that you're aware of that have status?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, yeah, it's interesting that the UNESCO has, I mean, Tel Aviv is a huge, I mean, that's a World Heritage Site now. Because it has the most Bauhaus buildings anywhere in the world. So many of the buildings that I did discuss are grade 2 star. I don't think any one of the grade 1s, but they are listed. Many of them are listed. Most of them are listed. Some of them are unfortunately not, but I think the Bexwell, the Delaware Pavilion, that's grade 2 star. So there is some recognition. Goldfinger's, yeah, Willow Road, but also other more controversial buildings have a listing. So there is recognition for them.
Right.
There's no overall encompassing, like in Tel Aviv. I think basically because it's there's not one area that you can categorize as something worth protecting.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, I think we've come to the end of the questions from people in the chat. Just one more that I have, and it's, again, going back to my background in architecture, but bearing in mind I started to study almost, just over 30 years ago. To what degree does modernist architecture nowadays, what influence or presence does that have in modern architectural training in the different architectural institutions throughout the country?
What, modernism?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I think the whole idea of a process to design. I mean, I guess every institution has its own ideology, but the idea that especially in the Bauhaus, that the design shouldn't be seen as I think the accomplishment that the Bauhaus did, that what was seen before. I mean, it has the Beaux-Arts School of Design and the École Polytechnique. That there was either something that's seen, you saw elevations as something that you draw. Mm-hmm. You had a structure, which was what the engineers did. And what the Bauhaus did is they combined the two together and said a building needs to be both structural and as a craft, and also something that is not only a two-dimensional kind of picture, an elevation, but a process of a design that you develop. We saw it as almost an organic process. And that's a huge contribution, because I think any school that you go to today will have that kind of process in place. Yeah. It's not only about just drawing a pretty elevation, and it's not only about even analyzing a structure. It's about combining all these elements and creating a narrative and an interesting journey in a design, and that is something that I think is common to any school today. So I think that's a huge contribution, because I mean, you look at the 19th century schools. I mean, they were completely classicist, very static, and dynamicism that the Bauhaus brought is something that has really had a huge effect.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Ittai, it's been a pleasure, an absolute pleasure having you join us tonight. It's been fascinating, a very fascinating insight. To all of you who are still with us, we've been the ZF. I'm Steve Winston, the interim director at the ZF. We've been doing this in partnership with the World Zionist Organization here in the UK. And we have another very interesting webinar on the 2nd of August, which is all about, is it annexation or isn't it? So it's a very politically driven or politically focused webinar. So please do watch out on both the WZO and the ZF Facebook pages and Twitter accounts. And thanks again for joining us. Ittai, it's been a pleasure, as I've said. Thank you very much. And we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Let's go out.
Leertraat.